imagine for me that this is your arm and that is your shoulder. We're going to look at joint forces, which is a term that gets thrown around, but we can demo what it means in a really obvious to understand way, really simply with this small piece of wood, that little fulcrum, a couple of weights, and a small scale. So what we're going to need to understand, we're going to put a weight on the far end of your arm. Remember, this is your arm, obviously, and that is your shoulder. If I put a load there, and yet my muscular attachment is somewhere up here, because obviously it doesn't attach down on the bottom of my arm, at least I hope not, then yes, it has to produce more force because it's got a mechanical disadvantage over the load. That's basic lever mechanics. But you're also going to see something about how much this joint has to produce to overcome it. Because if I was to put a load right there, and then I was to also hook this guy up, let's say we did have it attached at basically the same point as each other, I can hold that guy up with that. And look, that's stable, nothing happens over there. But if I pop this down, what happens if I recreate, let's say the halfway kind of point along this ruler, something like that, right? Well, we know I'm going to have to come up with twice the amount of force in order to overcome that load because, well, the leverage, the mechanical advantage isn't the same. But there's going to be a bigger problem. Oh crap, a force being applied here when that's pushing down has to be anchored. If I do not anchor this guy at this point, then this cannot lift it. It can only lift it, and it's going to require about twice the amount because it's about half the distance. But that is only true if the joint is itself held down by something. Now you can't see because it's just in my thumb, but rest assured, the further I get to here, the more my thumb has to do to hold this end down. And also, I mean, look at that. You can see that's pulled the spring right to the bottom of its capacity to lift that 100-gram weight. Well, what happens if I move this in? Let's put that at the 11-inch mark. It's 11, but I've got this set up on the 1 on here, so that's 10. So if I lift around the 6 on here, you're going to see, look, it doesn't need to distort the spring as much. That's mechanical advantage. But I've still got the same problem. It's still going to lift that up. So the joint force calculation is pretty straightforward. Let's say we've got an attachment here, and it's pulling up, and I've got this load pushing down. The amount that the joint has to do is this force minus this force. So if this force here was 20, and this force here was 10, and this was twice as far away, then the joint is left over, 20 minus 10, is left over with 10 units of some kind of force thing that we're talking about that it has to push down in order to balance this thing out. So if that's at that point there, and I put this roughly halfway, this force has to be twice what that is in order to rotate this guy. But in order to do that, it requires a certain amount of force pushing down where my thumb is to stop that happening. And that gets more and more pronounced the further this load gets away or the closer the attachment gets into the joint. So if we wanted to lower the amount of stress your shoulder is under, let's say you're coming back from an injury, you've got just beaten, worn up shoulders and you want to take a bit more care of them, then thinking about where is our attachment of the load relative to the attachment of the muscle? Because which one of those can we do something about? Hopefully you can't reattach your own deltoid. Assuming we can't, though, we're left with the only variable that we have to lower the joint force, which is deciding where we place the load that you're lifting. Let's say the delta is always going to be attached to this number 5 on here. Well, if I hold a dumbbell out here, that demands a lot more from the joint, my thumb pushing down, than if I attach the load with a cuff or with some variant where I get to put it here. That's going to, if I take it from 20 and I put it now at 10, that's going to halve the joint force. Let's say we've got this 100-gram, he's at a distance of 10, I've got this on the 1, I'm going to pull up on the 5. I know I have to produce 200 grams of force because of my mechanical disadvantage, but that means the joint has to also produce another 100 grams. Well, if I was then out here at the 20 and I'm still pushing up at the 5, well, now I have to produce 400 upwards with my finger. which means I've got 400 minus 100. So I've got 300 in my thumb now, holding this joint steady. If I was to change this from the 100, I'm going to double the load and put it back at that point there. And I push up. So we've now got 200. I'm still having to produce 400 now, because this is doubled. I'm still at 5. But that means the joint force is now 400 minus 200, which means my thumb is now only coming up with 200. The joint is dealing with 200 units of force, which means that this position with the same muscle attachment is less stressful on this joint than half the load is at that distance out there. That distance out there with this led to 300 units of force in the joint. This one right here, double the load, half the distance, same attachment point of the muscle, led to 200 units of force in the joint. And that is not up for debate, my favourite thing to say in physics, because it's demonstrably evident. It is true. I don't need an opinion on it. I don't need EMG to tell me it. I don't need really to debate it, which might sound arrogant, and we'll try and stay away from those types of statements. But the reality is they're true. And I think that's cool. And that is what joint forces are. Internal resistance minus the external resistance equals the joint force.